I spent 10 years marking timber in the deep woods of the Olympic Peninsula, believing I knew every danger in the forest. But in October of 1967, I ran into something that froze the blood in my veins. A 7-foot giant standing silently in my survey block. I thought it was a monster coming to kill me, but I was wrong. The creature wasn't hunting. It was stumbling. I realized that day that the king of the forest was going blind, and I was the only thing standing between him and the chainsaws. If you enjoy true stories about the secrets hidden in the deep woods and the strange bonds we form with the wild, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. This is the story of the 20 years I spent as the eyes for a blind Bigfoot. I was 34 years old and had spent nearly a decade walking the deep woods of the Olympic National Forest, marking timber for Cascade Timber Company. By October of 1967, I thought I knew every sound, every shadow, and every trick of the light in that remote, old-growth territory. I was a professional woodsman, focused and immune to the silly campfire stories the new hires told. My world was defined by the geometry of the tree stand and the cold logic of the harvest schedule, and I never wasted a minute looking for phantoms. That day, the air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and falling cedar needles. I was deep in a section we called the Green Cathedral, an area of massive, ancient Douglas firs that stood like columns supporting the sky. I was sighting down a large boundary line, preparing to spray the final marking paint on a 300-year-old tree, when something registered at the periphery of my vision. It was a dark vertical mass, standing absolutely motionless about 50 yards away, half obscured by the thick trunk of a fir. My first thought was that it was another cruiser, maybe a competitor from a rival company who had slipped into my claim block. But as I took a half-step sideways to get a better look, the sense of familiarity dissolved into a cold knot of confusion. The figure was too tall, impossibly broad across the shoulders, and unnaturally still. Human beings fidget, shift their weight, or lean. This figure was statuesque, absorbing the filtered sunlight without reflecting any of it back. It was like a shadow had detached itself from the forest floor and stood up. I lowered the can of fluorescent orange paint, my hand pausing halfway to my chest. I stared, trying to reconcile the shape with anything I knew. Bear, elk, man. It wasn't the bulk of a bear, which is low and round. It was upright, bipedal, with an economy of form that suggested massive power, not lumbering weight. My professional analysis failed me instantly, replaced by a visceral, primal dread that told me I was looking at something that did not belong in the inventory of known life. It was then that the creature moved. It wasn't a sudden action, but a slow, deliberate turn of the head, almost like a piece of heavy machinery pivoting on a well-oiled bearing. The motion was unnerving because it wasn't curious or startled. It was simply acknowledging my presence, assessing the small, paint-splattered human standing in its vicinity. It didn't lift its hands or make a sound. It just faced me fully, and I saw the sheer scale of the being. The face was lost in shadow, obscured by thick, dark hair that grew right up to a pronounced brow ridge. But I saw the eyes. They were wide-set, dark, and utterly devoid of fear, filled only with an ancient, neutral scrutiny. There was no aggression in the gaze, but there was an overwhelming sense of seniority, of being looked upon by something that had been in those woods since before my grandfather was born. All my fear coalesced into a single, crystalline thought. Run. I didn't run, but I nearly dropped my compass and the heavy paint can, which clattered to the dirt with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. The noise made the creature slightly shift its weight, a subtle repositioning of its immense bulk that suggested it was ready to move, though whether to flee or approach, I couldn't tell. I didn't wait to find out. My body decided for me, pivoting sharply and heading back down the fire trail at a pace that was entirely unprofessional. I didn't look back until I reached the cab of my battered Ford pickup, 300 yards away, throwing my gear into the passenger seat and slamming the door. I sat there shaking, breathing in shallow gasps of stale cabin air, forcing myself to look through the dusty rear window. The clearing was empty. The silent sentinel was gone, having slipped back into the Green Cathedral without a whisper. I started the engine, pulling out onto the rough logging road without bothering to finish my survey for the day. I drove all the way back to the ranger station in a cold sweat, trying to construct a rational explanation for what I had seen. A bear standing up? Too tall. A man in a ghillie suit? Too remote. Too silent. By the time I reached the paved road, I had convinced myself it was a trick of the light, the product of too many solo hours and too much cold coffee. But the cold fact remained. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to drive back to the Green Cathedral. My official report for that day simply noted, hazardous terrain, survey incomplete, a lie that cost me several hours of pay. But the encounter had done more than just scare me. It had fundamentally changed the way I viewed the forest. The woods were no longer just a resource to be logged. They were the home of a sentinel, and I was now an unwelcome guest. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would encounter it again, and I needed to figure out how to share its territory without provoking it. The winter of 1967 faded into a wet, clinging spring, and I returned to the Green Cathedral with a heavy pack and a sharp sense of alertness. I had avoided that specific ridge for months, but the job required my presence, and the fear had cooled into a professional wariness. As I walked the logging spurs, I realized the creature hadn't left. It had merely receded into the background of the thaw. I began to see the forest floor not as a workspace, but as a narrative written in the mud and the bark. The signs were there for anyone with eyes to see, and I was finally learning to look past the timber. I found the first set of prints by the creek in mid-April, deep oblong depressions in the gray silt that measured 17 inches from heel to toe. They were weighted with a density that a bear could only achieve on all fours, yet these were bipedal, spaced with a stride that made my own seem like a toddler's. The arch was flat, and the toes were splayed with a power that spoke of a life lived without the restriction of boots. I knelt in the cold mud and placed my own hand next to the print, feeling the residual gravity of the being that had stood there. It was an intentional placement, a marker left on the primary waterway. The tree bark told the rest of the story. Ancient cedars were stripped of their outer layers at a height of nearly 9 feet, exposing the red, sappy wood beneath. The patterns weren't random scratching or the antler rubs of a rutting elk. They looked deliberate, perhaps even communicative in their repetition. I mapped these signs across my 20-square-mile territory, realizing that they formed a perimeter around the most secluded clearings. This wasn't just wild behavior, it was an act of boundary setting by an intelligence I couldn't quantify. I was working in his living room, and he was letting me know exactly where the furniture was placed. Sharing space with a phantom requires a specific type of etiquette, a mutual respect built on the absence of aggression. I made it a point to move predictably, whistling softly to announce my presence before entering a new stand of trees so I wouldn't startle him. I left his marker trees alone, omitting them from my survey counts even if they were the best timber in the sector. In return, the feeling of hostile scrutiny I had felt the first year softened into a neutral, distant observation. We were two workers on the same mountain, adhering to a silent truce that kept the peace in the Green Cathedral. I began to anticipate his location by the behavior of the lesser animals, reading the forest's reaction to his invisible passage. The jays would stop their scolding and go silent when he moved nearby, and the deer would lift their heads in a specific stiff attention that didn't end in flight. I could sense the atmospheric displacement he created, a heavy static in the air that warned me when he was within 100 yards. It wasn't telepathy, it was just the natural sensitivity that develops when you live side by side with an apex predator. He was the landlord, and I was the tenant who paid my rent in silence and respect. There were days when I would find small gifts left on the stumps I had used for my lunch. A stack of smooth river stones or a bundle of cedar twigs. They weren't offerings to a god. They felt more like an acknowledgement, a receipt for the apples I began to leave on the ridgeline. It was a trade of curiosities, a way to test the boundaries of communication without the risk of physical contact. I realized then that he was as intrigued by me as I was by him, a lonely hominid studying the hairless ape with the marking paint. The solitude of the old growth was no longer empty. It was filled with a two-way scrutiny. My professionalism as a cruiser began to drift toward the personal, and I found myself spending more time observing the landscape than marking it. I kept a private logbook separate from my company files, noting the creature's seasonal patterns and the frequency of his visitations. I saw that he preferred the high ridges in the summer and the thermal cover of the ravines in the autumn, moving with a logic tied to the migration of the elk. He was the most efficient hunter I had ever seen, though I never saw the kill, only the leftovers. He left no waste, taking only what he needed, a discipline my company would never understand. The loggers on the other side of the ridge remained oblivious, their chainsaws and bulldozers a distant mechanical scream that kept the creature away from the valley floor. He seemed to understand that the man with the paint can was different from the men with the saws, a distinction that saved my life more than once. I was the bridge between his wild sanctuary and the industrial appetite of the city, and I carried the weight of that secret like a stone in my pocket. I knew that if Cascade Timber ever found out about the resident, the Green Cathedral would be clear-cut in a week to avoid a conservation freeze. As the summer of 1968 peaked, I saw him more frequently, though always at the periphery, a dark shape blending into the vertical lines of the Douglas firs. He would watch me mark the trees for harvest, his head tilted in a way that suggested he was trying to understand the orange paint. I felt like a cartographer marking the map for an invasion, and the guilt began to color my work. He didn't see board feet and profit. He saw his shelter and his hunting ground being labeled for destruction. I tried to spare the trees near his bedding sites, manipulating the survey lines whenever I could. One evening in late August, I watched him from a distance as he navigated a scree slope near the high ridge, tracking his movement against the setting sun. He moved with his usual strength, but I noticed a strange micro-hesitation in his gait, a slight stumble as his foot touched a loose rock he should have seen. He stopped and tilted his head, his face turned toward the light in a scanning motion that seemed forced and focus-heavy. It was a tiny crack in his invincibility, a glitch in the natural perfection of his movement that I didn't yet know how to diagnose. The giant was perfect, but the mountain was starting to look a little different to him. By May of 1970, the routine of our coexistence had become as reliable as the tides, a silent partnership that I took for granted. I was surveying a dense stand of hemlock near the northern boundary, the morning sun cutting through the mist in sharp, blinding shafts of light. The creature was moving parallel to me, about 100 yards upslope, threading his way through a patch of alder saplings. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, admiring the fluid grace that I had come to envy over the years. But then, the unthinkable happened. A glitch in the perfect machine of his movement that stopped me cold. He was walking with a steady pace when he struck a low-hanging branch of a dead cedar, a thick limb that was directly at his eye level. It wasn't a glancing blow. He walked straight into it with his face, the wood snapping against his brow with a sickening crack. He recoiled violently, letting out a sharp, surprised grunt, flailing his arms as if attacking an invisible assailant. A creature that could spot a tick on a deer from 50 yards away had just walked blind into a stationary object. I lowered my clipboard, my stomach turning over, realizing that the invincibility of the giant was a lie. I spent the next few weeks shadowing him with a new clinical intensity, desperate to prove that it was just a moment of distraction. But the evidence piled up with heartbreaking consistency, painting a picture of a king losing his crown. I watched him navigate a boulder field, his movements hesitant and testing, his foot hovering over the ground before committing weight. He wasn't trusting his eyes, he was trusting his memory of the terrain. He moved his head in a constant swaying scanning motion, not looking at things, but trying to triangulate them with his ears and his nose. Through my binoculars, I finally got a clear look at his face in the direct sunlight, and the diagnosis was confirmed. His eyes, once deep pools of sharp amber intelligence, were clouded with a milky blue-gray haze. Cataracts, or perhaps some degenerative disease of the retina, had drawn a curtain across his world. He wasn't completely blind yet. He reacted to sudden changes in light and shadow, but the sharp detail required for survival in the wild was gone. He was navigating a high-definition world with low-resolution sensors. He began to rely heavily on tactile navigation, trailing his long fingertips along the rough bark of the trees as he walked. It was a subtle habit, one I might have missed if I wasn't looking for it, but it was his lifeline. He was reading the forest with his hands, using the texture of the Douglas firs and the slickness of the madrones to confirm his location on the mental map he had built over decades. He was connecting the dots of his territory by touch, tethered to the physical landscape in a way that made him vulnerable to any change. His hearing became his primary defense, his ears twitching at the sound of a falling leaf or a shifting rock. If a squirrel chattered to his left, his head snapped toward it instantly, locking onto the sound with a precision that compensated for his failing sight. He used his own vocalizations as a form of crude echolocation, making low, thumping sounds in his chest and listening to how they reverberated off the canyon walls. He was rebuilding his reality through acoustics, painting a picture of the valley with sound waves instead of photons. The tragedy of his condition was most apparent when he hunted. He could no longer chase down game or spot a grouse in the brush. He became a scavenger, reliant on finding carrion or digging for roots and grubs that didn't run away. I watched him spend hours turning over rotten logs, sniffing for beetles, a subsistence diet for a creature of his mass. He looked thinner, his ribs showing faintly through his coat, the reserves of his strength slowly draining away as the calorie count dropped. One afternoon in June, I watched him stumble over a root system that had been exposed by recent rains. He went down hard, catching himself on his hands, his face inches from a jagged rock. He stayed on the ground for a long time, not moving, just breathing into the dirt. It was a moment of profound defeat, the realization that the earth itself had become a trap for him. He stood up slowly, brushing the mud from his knees, and let out a soft, mournful keen that sounded like a child lost in the dark. I finally understood why he hadn't moved on, why he stayed in a territory that was becoming increasingly squeezed by the logging operations. He couldn't leave. He knew every rock, every tree, and every stream in the Green Cathedral by heart. It was the only place where he could move with any confidence. If he stepped outside the boundaries of his memory, He would be helpless, lost in a blur of unknown shapes. He was a prisoner of his own geography, trapped in the only safe harbor he had left. The realization shifted my role from observer to guardian. He wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was a disabled elder who needed protection from a world that had no mercy for weakness. I looked at the orange survey markers on the distant ridge, the harbingers of the harvest, and felt a cold dread settle in my chest. The timber company wasn't just coming for the trees. They were coming to destroy the Braille map that kept him alive. If they cut down his landmarks, he would be blind in a way that no amount of memory could fix. The summer of 1973 began not in the woods, but in a fluorescent-lit conference room in Seattle, where the fate of the Green Cathedral was decided with a red felt-tip pen. I sat at the back of the quarterly planning meeting, nursing a cup of stale coffee, watching my district supervisor tape a large topographic map to the wall. He smoothed out the creases, tracing a circle around the heart of my survey area, the 300 acres of old-growth fir that served as the creature's living room. "Market prices are up," he announced, his voice dry and devoid of sentiment. "We're opening up Sector 4. We want it clear-cut by November." I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading through my extremities as I stared at the red lines bisecting the contour intervals. They weren't just planning a harvest, they were planning an eradication. The proposed cut boundaries included the primary den site under the cedar snag, the creek bed where he scavenged for crawfish, and the ridgeline he used to navigate. To the company, it was just board feet and profit margins. To me, it was the systematic destruction of a blind man's house. If they leveled those trees, they would wipe out the tactile landmarks he used to orient himself in the dark. I raised my hand, my voice trembling slightly as I tried to frame my objection in the language of economics rather than ecology. "That terrain is unstable, Jim," I lied, leaning forward. "The soil composition on those slopes won't hold a road. You'll lose equipment to slides, and the replanting costs will be astronomical." I threw every technical excuse I could think of at the map. Erosion, watershed violation, poor timber quality due to rot. I was desperate, grasping at straws to build a wall of bureaucracy around the giant. Jim didn't even turn around. He just tapped the map with his pen, a rhythmic sound that felt like a gavel. "We've had the geologists out there, Bill. It's stable enough. We need the quota. The road crews start on Monday." The finality in his tone crushed the air out of the room. There was no appeal process, no environmental impact statement that could save us. The machine of industry had decided to eat the mountain, and I was just a cog expected to grease the gears. I walked out of that meeting feeling like an accomplice to a murder. I drove back to the territory the next day, the nausea in my stomach churning with every mile marker that passed. The silence of the forest, usually my sanctuary, now felt like the quiet before an execution. I could already hear the distant grinding roar of the road-building crews 5 miles down the valley, the vanguard of the invasion. They were blasting rock and pushing dirt, carving a scar into the earth that would lead the chainsaws straight to his door. I had to warn him, though I had no idea how to explain the concept of eviction to a creature that owned the earth. When I reached the clearing, the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, static energy that made the hair on my arm stand up. The creature wasn't sleeping or sitting. He was pacing the perimeter of the grove, thrashing through the ferns with a reckless lack of stealth. He was making sounds I had never heard before, high-pitched, chirping distress calls mixed with deep, resonant growls of frustration. He couldn't see the bulldozers miles away, but he could hear them, and he could feel the vibrations of the blasting in the soles of his feet. He knew the dragon was waking up. He sensed me immediately, spinning around with a speed that belied his age, his clouded eyes scanning the air for my scent. He didn't wait for my whistle. He rushed toward me, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. For the first time in our relationship, he broke the touch barrier aggressively. He reached out and grabbed my forearm, his fingers wrapping around my jacket with a grip that was desperate and bruising. He wasn't attacking, he was anchoring himself. He was terrified, and I was the only thing in his world that could explain the noise. He pulled me, tugging insistently toward the ridgeline that overlooked the lower valley, his grip tight enough to numb my hand. We stumbled up the slope together, the blind giant and the reluctant prophet, until we reached the vantage point. Below us, a plume of dust rose into the clear blue sky, marking the progress of the road crew. The yellow machines looked like toys from this height, but the destruction they left behind was absolute. He turned his head, cocking his ear toward the mechanical roar, his nostrils flaring as he scented the diesel and the pulverized rock. He let out a moan that I will never forget, a sound of pure, hollow grief that seemed to vibrate in the canyon walls. He pointed a trembling hand toward the dust cloud, then turned his face to me, his milky eyes searching for an answer. He was asking if it could be stopped. He was asking if I could make the noise go away. I stood there, tears stinging my eyes, and gently shook my head. knowing he could feel the motion in the air. I placed my hand over his, a futile gesture of comfort against the apocalypse. We stood there until the sun went down and the machines finally fell silent for the night, leaving a ringing emptiness in the air. He didn't want to leave the ridge. He wanted to stand guard, as if his presence alone could hold back the tide of progress. I knew then that he wouldn't run. He couldn't run. He was blind, old, and mapped to this specific acre of earth. If the trees fell, he would fall with them. I realized I had to stop acting like a surveyor and start acting like a conspirator. We had to develop a new system of survival before the first saw touched his sanctuary. By 1975, the immediate threat of the bulldozers had paused. My frantic reports of unstable soil had bought us a temporary reprieve, diverting the cut to the next valley over. But the peace was fragile, and our interactions had mutated into something entirely pragmatic out of necessity. We weren't just companions anymore. We were operating a two-man survival cell in a hostile environment. The blindness had locked him into a world of sound and touch, meaning my visual signals, the waves, the nods, were now useless. We had to invent a new syntax, a language of vibration and pitch that could cut through the fog and the trees without alerting the loggers miles away. The foundation of this system was the whistle code, a sequence I practiced in my truck until I could hit the notes perfectly, even with dry lips. 3 short bursts, followed by 1 long rising note, meant, "I am here and I am alone." It was our all-clear signal, the auditory key that unlocked his tension and allowed him to step out from the cover. If I varied the pitch, dropping the final note into a minor key, it meant caution, perhaps a plane overhead or a bear nearby. He learned to distinguish these nuances with an audiophile's ear, his head snapping toward the sound, analyzing the frequency to determine the safety level before he broke cover. In return, he developed a percussive language, using the resonant qualities of the hollow cedar snags that dotted his territory. A single thunderous wood knock meant, "Where are you?" A query that demanded an immediate whistle response from me to triangulate my position. 2 quick knocks meant, "Come to the den," usually indicating he was hungry or cold. 3 slow rhythmic thuds were a distress signal, a sound that made my blood run cold whenever I heard it echoing off the canyon walls. It was a Morse code of the timber, primitive but effective, allowing us to locate each other across a mile of dense undergrowth without ever seeing one another. Close-range communication became a symphony of guttural sounds that expressed emotion rather than location. The low, vibrating rumble, the purr, was his way of saying he was content, usually emitted when he was eating the food I brought or warming himself. It was a sound that vibrated the ground, a physical sensation of peace that I could feel in my boots. Conversely, a sharp, explosive bark meant freeze. I learned to obey that sound instantly, stopping mid-stride without asking why. Every time I did, I would inevitably see a rock slide start or a predator move in the distance. His hearing was seeing things my eyes missed. Because he couldn't see my gestures, touch became a critical component of our dialogue, breaking the final taboo of the wild. I would guide his hand to objects I wanted him to understand. A new tool, a strange piece of trash blown in from the logging camp, or a patch of ice. I would tap the back of his hand twice to signal, "Let go," or "Drop it." He would grip my shoulder to steer me, his fingers providing directional cues like a rudder on a boat. We were navigating the world like a blind man and his guide dog, except the blind man weighed 800 pounds and could crush a car. He developed a clicking vocalization, a rapid-fire tick-tick-tick made with his tongue against the roof of his mouth, which served a function I didn't understand at first. I realized he used it when we were moving through dense brush. He was listening to the echo of the clicks bouncing off trees and rocks. It was biological echolocation, a way to paint a sonic picture of the obstacles in his path. When he clicked rapidly, I knew he was confused or disoriented, and I would whistle softly to give him a fixed point of reference to lock onto. We also utilized the wind, playing the air currents like an instrument to carry information via scent. I started wearing the same unwashed wool coat every time I visited, impregnating it with wood smoke and pipe tobacco so he could smell me coming from a mile away. He would lift his nose, inhaling deep drafts of the air, identifying my specific chemical signature among the smells of the forest. If the wind was wrong, I would circle around until I was upwind, announcing my arrival with my scent before I made a sound, giving him the comfort of identification before I approached. The most complex concept we tackled was time, specifically how to communicate when I would return. I couldn't use a calendar, so I used the sun. I would guide his hand to the horizon, tracing the arc of the sun, and then tap his palm for the number of days. 3 taps meant 3 days. It was crude and often inaccurate due to my work schedule, but it gave him a framework of expectation. He seemed to grasp the counting, often holding up fingers to confirm the number, negotiating the terms of his solitude so he wouldn't pace the clearing waiting for me. This system required a level of intimacy that erased the boundaries between species. We were two halves of a single sensory organism. I was the eyes, scanning for color and movement. He was the ears and the nose, processing the invisible data. We moved through the woods in a tight formation, me leading, him trailing with a hand often resting on my pack for guidance. To an outsider, it would have looked insane, a timber cruiser leading a monster on a leash of trust. But to us, it was the only way to survive the encroaching world. By 1978, our language was fluent, a seamless integration of sound and touch that allowed us to navigate the summer months with relative ease. I thought we had solved the puzzle of his disability, that we had created a safety net that could catch any fall. But systems break when the parameters change, and nature was brewing a variable we hadn't accounted for. The winter that was approaching wasn't just a season, it was a siege event that would bury our landmarks, mute our sounds, and test whether our communication could survive when the world turned white and silent. The winter of 1978 didn't descend on the Olympic Peninsula. It crashed into it with the violence of a geological event. The meteorologists called it a historic anomaly, a convergence of Arctic high pressure and moisture that turned the forest into a frozen tomb. By January 1979, the snowpack in the Green Cathedral was pushing 6 feet, burying the landmarks I used to navigate and turning the familiar trails into alien white tunnels. I was 45 years old, feeling the ache of every cold front in my lower back, struggling just to keep my own wood stove fed in the drafty cabin down valley. But my misery was nothing compared to the terror I felt for him. For a sighted animal, winter is a hardship. For a blind giant, it is a death sentence. The snow did more than just bury his food sources. It muted the acoustic landscape he relied on to survive. The soft powder snow absorbed sound waves, dampening the echolocation clicks he used to navigate, effectively blinding him a second time. The deep drifts hid tripping hazards, fallen logs, holes, sharp rocks, turning every step into a potential bone-breaking disaster. He was trapped in a sensory void, unable to move without risking injury, unable to hunt without hearing the prey. He was grounded, anchored to his den tree by a white paralysis. I realized within the first week that our usual routine of a weekly visit wasn't going to cut it. He couldn't forage for supplemental calories. He was entirely dependent on what I brought him. If I missed a drop, he wouldn't just be hungry, he would freeze. His metabolic furnace needed immense fuel to maintain his body temperature in sub-zero conditions, and without movement to generate heat, he was vulnerable to hypothermia. I made the decision to triple my rotation, committing to a punishing schedule of hauling supplies up the mountain 3 days a week, regardless of the weather. I built a heavy-duty sled from scavenged runner skis and a plastic hull, rigging a harness that allowed me to pull 80 pounds of gear. I loaded it with high-density calories, blocks of sweet, 50-pound bags of oats, smoked hams, and dry cordwood. The hike, which usually took me an hour in the summer, turned into a 3-hour agonizing slog through thigh-deep powder. My lungs burned in the freezing air, my sweat turning to ice inside my layers, but the thought of him shivering in the dark drove me forward. I was a pack mule for a king in exile, the only supply line keeping the fortress alive. Finding him became a challenge in itself. He had retreated deep into the hollow of a massive, burned-out cedar snag, effectively burying himself to escape the wind. The first time I arrived after the big storm, I couldn't find the entrance. The snow had drifted over the opening, sealing him inside an ice cave. I had to dig him out, my shovel striking the wood, terrified I would find a corpse. When I finally broke through, a puff of warm, steam-filled air escaped, smelling of musk and stale breath. He was huddled in the back, wrapped in the tarps I had given him, shaking so hard the tree vibrated. He couldn't see me, and with the snow muffling my footsteps, he didn't hear me until I whistled. The reaction was pathetic and heartbreaking. He reached out a trembling hand from the darkness, groping blindly for contact. When I took his hand, his skin was dangerously cold, his movements sluggish and lethargic. I wasted no time building a fire right there in the shelter entrance, ignoring the smoke, needing to get heat into him fast. I heated water mixed with molasses and poured it into his mouth, watching his throat work to swallow, fighting the torpor that was trying to claim him. We spent the worst nights of February huddled together in that cedar snag, sharing the warmth of the fire and our bodies. I would sit with my back against his side, feeling the slow, heavy beat of his heart, feeding the small fire with the wood I had hauled up. He would rest his chin on his chest, drifting in and out of sleep, occasionally reaching out to touch my coat to make sure I hadn't vanished into the storm. We were two mammals reduced to the basics of biology: heat, food, and proximity. The majestic separation of species had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The physical toll on me was becoming unsustainable. I lost 20 pounds that winter, burning calories faster than I could replace them, my own body cannibalizing itself to keep the sled moving. My knees, already damaged from years of timber cruising, swelled and ground together with every step. I fell multiple times on the trail, once nearly sliding off a ravine edge, catching myself on a root at the last second. I lay in the snow, staring at the gray sky, wondering if I was going to die on this mountain trying to save a myth. But then, I would hear his phantom whistle in my head and get back up. By March, the snow began to heavy up and melt, turning the world into a slushy, treacherous mess, but we had made it. I found him one morning standing outside the den, leaning against the tree, his face turned toward the weak spring sun. He looked gaunt, his ribs showing through the matted wet fur, and his coat was dull and patchy. But he was standing. He heard me coming and turned his head, letting out a weak but distinct rumble of greeting. We had survived the siege. The winter hadn't killed him, and it hadn't killed me, though it had taken a piece of us both. As the spring of 1979 bloomed, revealing the damage to the forest, I realized that the recovery wasn't going to be a bounce back like in previous years. The winter had aged us. I felt it in my own stiffness, the way my back didn't straighten fully in the mornings. And looking at him, seeing the way he hesitated before taking a step, seeing the gray that now covered his entire muzzle and chest, I knew the damage was permanent. The snow had melted, but the cold had settled into our joints to stay. We were entering a new era, one defined not by strength and survival, but by the slow, grinding friction of decline. The early 1980s arrived with a cruelty that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cruelty of biology, the slow, grinding erosion of the body against the passage of time. I was approaching 50, a milestone that felt more like a warning shot in my line of work. The decades of hiking over deadfall and sleeping on cold ground had caught up to me, manifesting as a constant dull fire in my lower back and knees that popped like pistol shots on cold mornings. The mountain, which had once been a playground I conquered with ease, had become a formidable opponent that fought me for every foot of elevation gain. I was slowing down, needing more breaks, more ibuprofen, and more willpower just to reach the sanctuary. But watching my own decline was nothing compared to the heartbreak of watching him. The creature, the titan of the Green Cathedral, was withering before my eyes. The gray that had frosted his muzzle in the 70s had spread like a fungus, turning his entire coat into a patchy, dusty silver that looked like old moth-eaten wool. His muscle mass, once the envy of any bodybuilder, had wasted away, leaving his skin hanging loose over prominent bones. He looked shrunken, a diminished version of the shadow that had terrified me in 1967. His majesty replaced by a frail vulnerability. His movement was the most painful indicator. The fluid, silent glide that allowed him to vanish into thin air was gone. He moved with a stiff, hitching gait, favoring his right hip with every step, his massive arms swinging heavily to maintain balance. I could hear his joints grinding, a wet popping sound that echoed in the silence of the den. Arthritis had settled deep into his skeleton, calcifying the magnificent machine that had once leaped over 6-foot logs. He spent most of his time sitting, conserving energy, his head hanging low as if the weight of his own skull was too much to bear. We became a pair of invalids, checking our symptoms against each other in the quiet of the grove. I would rub my aching knee, and he would watch me, then slowly reach down to massage his own swollen hock with a gnarled hand. It was a moment of shared biological reality, a recognition that gravity eventually wins every war. I started bringing him aspirin crushed into honey balls, which he took with a grateful gummy mouth, seeking relief from the inflammation that plagued us both. We were no longer warriors guarding a fortress. We were patients in an open-air hospice. In 1981, the fragility of our arrangement was hammered home when I suffered a minor heart attack on the trail. I collapsed half a mile from the den, clutching my chest, the world graying out around the edges as the pain radiated down my arm. I lay there in the dirt for an hour, terrified not of dying, but of dying there, where he might find me. The thought of him stumbling over my body, confused and alone, gave me the adrenaline to crawl back to my truck. I spent 6 weeks recovering in the hospital and at home, staring at the ceiling, consumed by the panic of his abandonment. When I finally managed to hike back up, weak and pale, the scene that greeted me broke my heart. He was sitting on the observation rock, emaciated and still, staring down the trail where I usually appeared. He hadn't moved to forage. He hadn't retreated to the deep cover. He had waited. He looked at me with those milky, blind eyes and let out a sound that was half whimper, half roar, a vocalization of pure relief and accusation. He thought I had left him to die. He thought the pact was broken. Our routine shifted permanently after that. There were no more patrols, no more lessons, no more games. I became a caretaker, purely and simply. I hauled up high-calorie food because he could no longer hunt effectively. His blindness and his stiffness made catching game impossible. He became a scavenger of my backpack, waiting for the ham and the apples with the desperation of a starving child. I had to cut the food into smaller chunks because his teeth were worn down to nubs, making chewing difficult. The apex predator was gone, replaced by a dependent who needed me to survive the week. The world outside was moving faster, the logging trucks getting louder and the planes flying lower. But our world had shrunk to a 50-yard circle around the cedar snag. He didn't react to the noises anymore. He didn't have the energy to be afraid. He would just sit there, trembling slightly when a jet roared over, waiting for the silence to return. He was withdrawing from the sensory input, his world narrowing down to the warmth of the sun on his face and the smell of the food I brought. He was preparing to leave, disconnecting the wires one by one. I spent those afternoons sitting beside him, reading aloud or just talking, trying to keep him tethered to the present. I told him about the world below, about my own fears of getting old, about the changes in the forest. He would lean against my shoulder, a massive, heavy weight, his breathing rattling with a wet congestion that never seemed to clear. We were two old ghosts haunting a mountain that had forgotten us, clinging to each other because there was nothing else left. By the autumn of 1987, the decline accelerated into a freefall. He stopped standing up to greet me, merely lifting a hand in a weak wave from his bed of ferns. His appetite waned, the food I brought left largely untouched, piling up near his head. I knew the signs. I had seen them in my parents and in my dogs. The body was shutting down, the spirit looking for the exit. I hiked up the trail on October 15th with a heavy dread in my gut, knowing that the final page was about to be turned, and praying I would have the strength to read it. The morning of October 15th, 1987 was unnervingly beautiful, the kind of crisp, golden autumn day that usually made me glad to be alive in the woods. But as I hiked up the familiar trail to the cedar snag, my chest felt tight, constricted by a premonition that had been building for weeks. I was 54 years old, my knees wrapped in braces, carrying a backpack that felt heavier than it should have. The woods were silent, the birds absent, as if the entire ecosystem was holding a vigil. I didn't whistle when I approached the perimeter. I knew, with a heavy sinking certainty, that there was no one left to hear it. I found him lying in his den beneath the massive, sweeping branches of the ancient cedar, in the exact spot where he had weathered 20 winters. He was curled on his side, his legs drawn up slightly, looking for all the world like he was just taking a nap in the sun. But the stillness was absolute, a lack of vibration that screamed of death from 50 feet away. I dropped my pack and walked the final yards, my boots feeling like lead weights. There was no rise and fall of the massive ribcage, no steam rising from his nostrils in the chill air. The king was dead. I knelt beside him in the soft mulch of cedar needles, reaching out to touch the silver fur of his shoulder. He was cold, the heat of the biological furnace finally extinguished, leaving behind a husk of heavy muscle and bone. His blind eyes were closed, a mercy that gave his face a peaceful, almost relieved expression. The lines of pain and tension that had defined his features for the last decade were smoothed away. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an old man who had finally been allowed to put down a heavy burden he had carried for too long. One of his massive hands was resting on the wool blanket I had brought him 3 days earlier, his fingers curled loosely into the fabric. I placed my own hand over his, feeling the rough texture of his skin one last time, marveling at the sheer scale of him even in death. I sat there for hours, the grief washing over me in waves that felt physical, deeper and sharper than when my own parents had passed. I hadn't just lost a friend. I had lost the center of my universe, the secret axis around which my entire adult life had revolved. I realized as the sun began to shift through the trees that I couldn't leave him exposed. I couldn't dig a grave. The roots were too thick and the ground too rocky for one man to move that much earth. I decided to cover him, to build a cairn of wood and stone that would protect him from the scavengers and the elements. I spent the afternoon dragging heavy branches, piling ferns and stones, constructing a natural tomb that blended perfectly with the forest floor. It was exhausting, back-breaking labor, a final act of service to the creature I had served for 20 years. As I worked, I talked to him, my voice cracking in the quiet clearing. I thanked him for the trust, for the patience, for not killing me that first day in the Green Cathedral. I told him he was safe now, that the loggers couldn't hurt him, that the blindness didn't matter anymore. It was a eulogy spoken to the trees, a private ceremony for a congregation of one. I covered his face last, placing a piece of soft moss over his eyes, unable to look at the stillness any longer. When the work was done, he was just a large mound of forest debris, indistinguishable from a fallen tree to anyone who didn't know better. I gathered up the old tarps, the food bowls, the remnants of our life together, scrubbing the site clean of human presence. I wanted to leave no trace that I had been there, No clue that might lead a future hiker to disturb his rest. He belonged to the mountain now, his atoms destined to cycle back into the soil that had sustained him. I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back one last time, the long shadows of evening stretching across his grave. The woods felt profoundly empty, hollowed out and vacant, as if the spirit of the place had departed with him. I realized that the Green Cathedral wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was just a stand of timber. The magic was gone. I turned and walked away, my footsteps heavy on the trail, leaving my heart buried under a pile of cedar boughs. I retired from the timber company a month later, unable to walk the woods without seeing his ghost in every shadow. I destroyed my maps, burned my logbooks, and never spoke a word of it to anyone. I spent the rest of my life in a small house by the ocean, listening to the waves, trying to forget the silence of the high country. But sometimes, when the wind blows from the east, I can still smell the musk and the pine, and I can hear the phantom echo of a wood knock answering my whistle. I am an old man now, and the secrets are all I have left. The world moves on, noisy and blind, completely unaware of the giant who lived and died in the shadow of their industry. But I remember the amber eyes, the touch of the hand, and the truce we kept for 20 years. He was the better part of me, the wild soul I wished I could be. And I know that somewhere in the deep green dark of the Olympic Peninsula, he is waiting for the forest to grow back over his bones, safe at last.